subsequent buildings were developed. And that's why this house doesn't face the road, because it was there well before that road ever existed. And so as such, together, these buildings, the relationship between them, along with the subsequent homes and their additions, all their oddities and quirkiness, tell part of that fascinating and still legible story about Charlottesville's growth and development. We had really good conversation about this project, and really will just boil down to three major impacts. There's impact of the site demolition, there's the impact of the addition of parking, and there's negative impacts on the historic district. First, and there's numerous guidelines that Jeff read some of them related to the importance of site elements. In particular, I'll highlight that from Chapter 2, the relationship between a historic building and its site, landscape features, outbuildings, and other elements within the property boundary all contribute to a historic district's overall image. Site features should be considered an important part of any project to be reviewed by the Board of Architectural Review. In other places, Chapter 2 is maintain existing materials such as stone walls. Chapter 2, retain existing trees that help define a character of the district. Chapter 4, Section D, do not remove or radically change entrances and porches, important in defining the building's overall historic character. This proposal removes significant sections of historic wall, existing trees, and a side terrace that was a side exit from the house and an important architectural element. Related to parking lots, our guidelines are pretty clear. Chapter 2, Section F says locate parking lots behind buildings. Number 3, avoid creating parking areas in the front yards of historic building sites. Later, avoid excessive curb cuts to gain entry to parking areas. Avoid large expanses of asphalt. I'll note that we were told that the fire department was trying to be able to get access into and through this parking lot, because they now would have access to the building. Furthermore, the Secretary of Interior standards, which we also rely on, is very clear. Locating parking areas directly adjacent to historic buildings where vehicles may cause damage to buildings or landscape features when they negatively impact the historic character of the building site is not recommended. Also not recommended, introducing new construction on the building site which is visually incompatible in terms of size, scale, design, material, or color, which destroys historic relationships on the site, or which damages or destroys important landscape features, such as replacing a lawn with paved parking areas or removing mature trees to widen a driveway. Briefly, this proposal, almost to a T, follows all of the recommendations of what not to do. In some ways, the impact on the neighborhood is the most critical. One of our guiding principles as a BAR in section 34-284 is to approve applications unless that we find that the proposal is incompatible with the historic, cultural, or architectural character of the district in which the property is located, or the protected property that is the subject of the application. Our guidelines define Preston Place as a moderate-scale, single-family residential neighborhood constructed in the 1920s and 30s, with the exception of Windhurst, 605 Preston Place, built in 1857, which was the original farmhouse on the property, which is not quite correct. Porches, brick, wood frame, a variety of architectural styles, deep setbacks, and wooded lot. This proposal introduces a large, extensive parking lot on the key defining property of the district, at a scale that is out of character with all of the driveways and parking areas on Preston Court, and is out of scale with the largely wooded, canopied residential street. In addition, we heard multiple complaints from the public about the change that this would bring. Lastly, I just want to say, at least from my perspective, and many of the BAR share this perspective too, it's not to say that no changes on this site would ever be permissible on this property. Our guidelines, the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, and even our own experience shows that it is very possible to build sensitively in a historic context. That is possible here, but that is not the proposal that has been brought forward tonight, and we urge you to uphold our carefully considered denial.
we ask you questions?
Yes, you can ask them questions.
Can I ask you questions?
We need to,
Sure.
your legal reading.
No, we're not going to do
Me too.
No. Okay. Okay. 'Cause that's,
that. Sure.
It's around the use. So we're not denying the use, just the form of that use in this context, given it's part of the control
Correct. You're
district.
denying, you're not denying a use as, say, a by right or special use permit. What you're doing is saying these particular guidelines apply to the use and that the owner would have to comply with those guidelines in order to implement the use.
okay. All right, that's a good clarification.
Mr. Blair, I don't know how to ask this question because we had a very direct legal challenge / threat raised in the applicant's presentation, and I don't know what part of that you can address in public because we typically get legal advice in closed settings. So I just want to flag it because it was just, even by raising it in that way, it makes me, which I'm sure is the intent, it makes me a little cautious about responding. So I guess one of the questions is, to the extent you could say anything publicly, is your assessment that we're okay moving ahead with some decision here?
Well, I think you can move ahead with your decision. I think, and again, as any attorney will tell you, obviously anything an attorney says can't stop a suit if that's what is, the applicant has made up their mind, or the appellant in this case has made up their mind. But in terms of just purely a taking, I don't think, from what I've heard tonight, that this would hit that threshold of a taking. A taking, in effect, if I recall correctly, is much more about taking away the use of the property in general. It's not saying that in order to comply with this use, you need to comply with these guidelines. We're not saying that you can't use your property, you just need to comply with the guidelines. Now, legally, what I would say is your decision in terms of this appeal is about what's called a fairly debatable standard. And that just means, could a reasonable, I think is the term that's used in the court decisions, could reasonable minds disagree? And if reasonable minds can disagree, your position would be upheld in terms of a legal challenge to the Board of Architectural Review if you were to uphold what they did. And again, the same would apply if you said, no, I agree with the appellant, so long as it's reasonable as to what you're doing. And reasonable minds could disagree.
Okay, that's very helpful. And on the specific allegation that the parking is a by right use and that the way that the BAR has approached this has constituted a denial of that use, because what's your assessment of that to the?
Well, I would say the following. Again, has the BAR said you can't use the parcel itself for parking? I think that's when you're talking denial of use. Mm-hmm. I think if the BAR is saying we have particular guidelines in order to execute the use. Mm-hmm. Now, I think where this gets a little bit hazy, but I didn't hear the BAR representatives say this tonight, is to say, even if you comply with our guidelines, you can't do the use. But if the BAR is simply saying, we have these particular guidelines for this particular parcel for this use, and they didn't feel that the applicant met those guidelines, then they are within their rights to deny the certificate of appropriateness. I think, when you're talking about use.
Interesting. I think I have one other question, but I think it's really quick. Mm-hmm. So, sorry. So Is there a way that the BAR would allow parking here if a whole bunch of requirements were met? You probably have to be careful in your answer from what we.
Well, I can't speak for the whole BAR, and also the BAR is going to be, composition will be changing next year as well. I think that we entertain proposals all the time that work to work with our historic context and do that in a sensitive way. I think the scale of the parking was a subject of a lot of our conversation. It was clear to us that this was out of keeping with the scale of the structure that it's associated with. I mean, you can see the handicap spot is located in the furthest spot away from the structure. I think that says a lot about the scale that it's really trying to satisfy. I think that there are many possibilities personally where architectural development of this site would be perfectly permissible and done in a sensitive way. It might even be better in the residential context.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
So what are we doing?
So now we have to talk.
Right, so now I think you would talk amongst yourselves about what you've heard from both the appellant, the BAR, and Mr. Warner, and then you would need to make a resolution to either, in effect, grant the appeal and issue a certificate of appropriateness, or make a motion to deny the appeal.
And there's this option for a work session with the bar in an effort to develop an acceptable design. That looks,
But when I read that, I just thought in terms of if there wasn't a new design submitted, what would they be working from? Because it didn't seem
Yeah.
like with this particular,
so I guess my question is, if this is a dead end, how do they reevaluate other approaches? Is it like an SUP where when it's done, it's done? I'm really not clear.
Just one quick thing. Per code, if, based on your decision, the next level is, I believe, an appeal at the
To the circuit court.
circuit court. So just so that's clear, that's stipulated in the code. What we do, and in fact, I'll use the example of the court expansion. We're getting a lot of calls from folks who are interviewing to get that project, and I've said, encourage you, come in as often as necessary for preliminary discussions with the BAR and talk through things and have that conversation. So that is not unusual at all. In fact, it's the way to go so that you get to a point where the BAR, and I was sitting in this seat here in October and listening to the BAR point things out, and they flat out told me, Jeff, you got some, you didn't see this, you should have done that. And I admitted I made an error, and I learned a lot. So there's an opportunity to work with the BAR, and we extend that to everyone. So I added that as an alternative, just if that might be acceptable to the applicant.
But even if we uphold this denial, they still have an opportunity to bring back a different schematic
Yes.
to the
Yes.
VRA without us intervening.
Yes.
So
Right.
I'd rather just let it happen organically. Okay.
okay, so,
I mean, I went up to the site this weekend myself just to see it firsthand, and I certainly can see the concerns that have been raised by the board, especially just how, dense it is and the proximity to this structure. It's significant.
So, Mayor Walker, I'll make a motion to deny the appeal? Is that as simple as that?
Yes.
Because there is no
and-
resolution.
Right, Exactly. It's a motion to deny the appeal, and I would encourage you as part of your motion to, and just say, and I cite for the reasons for my denial the same as the BAR cited.
So,
Which is, do you need us to read the uphold?
No, you just-
Okay.
Just reference that you're denying based on the provisions that the BAR cited for its denial.
so again, Mayor Walker, I'll repeat my motion. I move to deny the appeal for reasons based on the BAR's reason for denial.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All right, please vote. Carries 5-0. Thank you all. And for other business, the first thing we have is the ordinance. And is there any other? Okay.
There were, it was N and O.
Well, we voted on O and P.
Oh,
O
okay,
and
so it's
P
just
were
N.
voted.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's just in.
So, I guess the
Yeah.
best way to proceed would be as a motion.
Wait, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Which
we're doing
one's no?
N,
No?
one
Just
N.
in
The
the
adding
just that, I'm
section.
sorry.
resolutions
Yes.
for the,
So I
Or the-
guess to, Mayor Walker, if I may, since I asked to pull it, to get the ball rolling, and for discussions purposes, I would like to move to not adopt an ordinance adding section 2-159 to chapter 2, Administration, Article 3, City Manager of the Shawsell City Code, 1990.
Second.
And my reason for that is that when this change was first brought to my attention about a month ago, I hadn't fully grasped the implications of the proposal. And I did some homework. I looked at the Virginia Municipal League resources, and so I now have a lot of reservation about it. And if I may, I'd just like to read an excerpt from a publication. It was the May 2014 issue of Virginia Town and City. It's basically, it was now what? 50 tips from newly elected local government officials. So the VML advises that if a locality city charter prohibits council members from interfering in the administration of a city or town, which is ours, this is what our charter does, then the council really needs to basically let the manager do his or her job to run the locality. Among the manager's many responsibilities is supervising the city's department heads. This is impossible if the department heads and other staff are answering to silver bosses. Therefore, all complaints from the mayor and council should come through the city or town manager. If your role is strictly a legislative one, concentrate on setting policy and let your appointed administrative staff perform the jobs that the city is paying them to do, and then hold them accountable. So in light of that reflection, I do see that this really could be an encroachment upon the authority of the city manager in the way he or she would hire his or her right-hand people. And I think that that review and approval, asking for our consent on something that is that critical for the functioning of the city manager's office is an encroachment. I believe it's also could set a precedent for the council to increase its oversight on even more staff over time, and it could confuse the chain of command by requiring staff to think about answering to different bosses. So it also raises a question for me as to how many city managers we would have. If we're reviewing and approving a deputy city manager, who do they respond to when there's a performance evaluation? So I do believe it adds more confusion, and I do think it does, in a way, hamper the city manager's ability to pick his or her own staff, and that is not our function. Our function is legislative and policy. So that's my rationale and I'm open for discussion. And this can go up and down as a yes or no vote, but I really had strong reservations as I thought this through and read about it.
You know, I have reservations as well, and the point, I mean, Nakai and I talked about it several times in the last couple weeks. I think it's just, I guess, as far as I was looking for, is just what is a way that we could at least be part of just the process, not in a decision-making mode, but just have an awareness of what staff is coming on so that we have a chance to meet and to weigh in, but without any kind of authority. But this is clearly, to me, the way it's written, just showing that we have like a consent, like an approval, and that does give me pause.
And it changes our charter, our city code. It's not an understanding of a policy based on a personnel evaluation or something. It's changing the code of the city.
So I'll just say, one, that this came out of the conversations that we've had, which some of them, this just came out of conversations we had, so this wasn't just pulled out of, thin air. That's why this was presented. This wasn't just a me thing, so I feel like I need to say that. And for me, and as I've said, and even talking to the current person who's in that position, this wasn't about that individual. For me, it was, the conversation was around moving forward. If someone was hired into that position that was different from the assistant positions that were set up before, where in that equation does council come in? I do have some reservations, as I've expressed to all of you, about at which point we meet department heads and are introduced to them. And that is a discussion I guess we'll continue hopefully during our retreat next year. But that's what this was centered around, and especially with this person having a different title than the other individuals was the discussion that we had. I didn't come up with the language in it, as I was advised that this is the same language as the police chief and I've hired, that we sat in on. We didn't say this is who you must hire. We simply said, hey, these are our thoughts about the people that were presented to us, and we gave that information. And even explaining to Dr. Richardson that even for that hire with the police chief, that was the process here. And that is that something that is going to be different? Is a conversation that we've had, right? Yes. Okay. So I didn't, so again, this just came out of those conversations. I'm not tied. I thought this was a group conversation, but I still think no matter what happens with this decision right now, that there will be further discussions about what does this separation of powers look like? Because I'm still confused about it. And I, talked a little bit about it before, that we have 3 incoming counselors, but we've even had, so that's a different dynamic, and how they'll feel will be different. But even when we came on, the vote that the 3 of you had participated in kind of creating this separate government, because you all didn't feel like you were getting what was needed from the city manager at that time, and that you would have some kind of checks and balances in place. That's not, and I have consistently said that I didn't understand why we had to have that different structure. So I'm not trying to get in the weeds or do a job or create a council level of staff that could challenge information we get from the city council or present us with different information. And I just bring this up again to point out that even as we came on, Heather, that there was those conversations about the need for an even more robust build out on the council end to kind of challenge what wasn't being received according to the three counselors who were here, from their end. And I've consistently said that I didn't understand why this wasn't more of a team effort, and why did we feel that there was a need for these like two different, like I think of it as like a sub-government. So that is not my intention, because I have consistently, even when we think about the positions under council and who reports directly to council, I've consistently said that I didn't understand why we were doing things that way. So this is, again, was just simply a response to, to the conversations that we all were in the room.
No, and I don't disagree with that.
Okay.
It's just a matter of how it's implemented and just understanding our boundaries, and that's my greatest concern. Mr. Blair?
Could I speak to boundaries just for a minute, as the city charter has been invoked in this? And as you know, I went through the document. It was originally granted in 1946. And I went through the document and simply made purely non-substantive changes, because that's more council prerogative to make substantive changes. But Councilor Galvin, you mentioned something about an interference clause, and I was an assistant city attorney in Danville, and I just want to highlight to you that the Charlottesville City Charter says the city manager shall have full executive and administrative authority and shall have the right to employ and discharge all employees under his control. And let me read you something in the city of Danville's charter, and it's literally entitled Interference by Council. And it says, neither the council nor any of its members shall direct the appointment of any person to or his removal from any office or employment by the city manager or by any of his subordinates. And that's a substantively different proposition than what the current Charlottesville City Charter states. And so, I've sort of wondered when I got here about the police chief position, because in Danville that wouldn't occur because there is this specific charter provision. Here, it says the city manager can employ and discharge, but it doesn't really say like the council cannot have any role in that employment or discharge. Whereas in Danville, the city charter is quite clear. The city council cannot have any interference in employment decisions. So I would advise, I know you all have this discussion to go forward, but if that's something the council wants to look at, it might be something to consider for a future charter change. If you feel like you want, because you had quoted specifically about interference, there are city charters with the interference language in them, but Charlottesville does not have that.
Madam Mayor, Mr. Blair, really appreciate that.
That's great.
I think that with two incoming members of council with us, and I'll just share some of what I took away from the 4 years that I've been doing this in conversation with Dr. Richardson today. I think that with a new majority coming on, it is of utmost importance to achieve absolute clarity about these questions, because we had a prior city manager who did not come out of traditional city manager training. As the mayor just indicated, that created a tremendous amount of frustration when council was trying with extremely limited resources. So part of the goal, and I just want to offer a response, was not to create a government with council overview that would challenge the city manager. It was to do work for the labor that we had to do because we didn't have assistance in policy development and in communications and in scheduling. That was the goal. And because the whole part of the city manager's traditional role, which is facilitating council cooperation, that's like a whole part of their evaluation. If you look at all literature, that didn't happen with the prior city manager. So we were left doing it on our own. That was the source of creating the one position to the four. Mr. Snook here wrote some very critical essays that I thought were not that well informed about the it's okay.
Getting
It's,
off
you,
track.
you'll be up there soon
Yeah,
enough.
yeah.
You'll be up here soon enough. But and I thought it created a lot of misperception about what the goals actually were. But if you looked at the debates that we were having on the dais, that was the actual discussion we were having when we were trying to create this parallel, the unfortunate choice of words, parallel government. I think with the current city manager who's in this job for just a few months, the major concern is offering him support, because it is a major transition, and where I've responded, and the intensity of some of my comments has come from a concern that I have about providing him support in his assumption of a very traditional city manager role. And there has been a lot of discussion about challenging specifically what, in closed session and out of it, what Councilor Galvin has said here. This is the right way for a city manager to council manager form of government to do their job. And the lines were all kind of blurred before. What I think would be great, I think that submitting council charter changes would be fabulous. I think that coming in and actually with a lot of the literature around there, with new members of council, and just reading up on what is the council manager form of government, what are the best practices, what
Oh,
are
but
the
I-
bright line, and if I could just finish, I don't.
Yeah,
if I
go
could-
knock yourself out, Mike.
I think that really working with the new council majority and looking at the literature, looking at the right rules, the best practices, and developing the appropriate charter changes that would at long last kind of clarify this stuff, so it's not that confusing. Like school board, you're not allowed to communicate with staff without going through the city manager.
Yes,
You've been very generous in letting us do that, but you're not really supposed to do that in a lot of cities. And Madam Mayor, you have pushed back on that. You've talked very directly about how you don't agree with that. You would like a lot of direct communication with staff.
I mean, I
and-
think we're getting off track here, but
Well,
if you
no, I
want to
think
talk
that it's-
specifics,
Oh, I
'cause
think
that's
it's
not.
highly relevant
Okay,
to,
we can talk
that's
that.
the basis of my wanting to vote against this.
Okay.
Because I think it represents an erosion of the city manager's authority. And that's why I would vote against it.
And so I'll just go back to even the point that you just brought up in the discussions, because we were not here at that point. Counselor Bellamy didn't have those same issues according to, in terms of getting his needs met, getting policies drafted.
Well, he can speak for himself. I mean,
But this is, he can,
Sure.
but I'm just saying, in the discussions, that has been part of the discussion. So again, that was certain members of council, and at that time, you all made the
well,
decisions.
we can go through the comments that we had on the dais, Dr. Bellamy.
But I would
We-
like
we
to-
had-
Now I'm responding, if
agreement.
that's okay.
sorry.
And I don't even think that we have to, with this particular issue, have the discussions about whether someone is a traditional manager or not in this particular item. We can talk about that at a retreat. But all I have been asking, which is different, based on the other conversations in the room, there were other concerns. My concern is just that maybe we don't get information from Nolan, which I don't think is too much to ask, about who is being hired. Not in this particular position, but when you're talking about erosion of city manager duties, that has been my only ask. Can we know something maybe before he does? Right? That shouldn't be something that is considered getting in the weeds and attempting to do his job, because I'm not attempting to do his job. I don't want it. The other thing about staff is, if we are and this just happened, actually, and I'll bring it up in another conversation, but if staff has concerns and they can't talk to us, who do they talk to?
City manager. City manager's that's the way that the government works, and this shows the confusion about it. And we can ask Dr. Richardson. That they don't. It's not. But Dr. Richardson, what's generally the answer to that?
That's usually how it operates, and throughout my career, it's always been through the city manager who communicates to the staff. I'm not. I know.
But Mike, Counselor Signer is aware that right now we're not talking about staff having general concerns. So I think you brought a little bit too much into this conversation. at this point. We're not talking about staff having concerns about like whether the bus is gonna run and if they slap advertisement on the side of it. So that's a different conversation than if there are concerns about the city manager, who does the staff discuss those with, which is what you're talking about, which is a different conversation that I guess we're supposed to be having at a different time.
Well, I don't know,
But you
because-
are bringing it up as if this is the appropriate
No, I'm
time.
not. I'm not. I'm not.
Okay.
You are. But all I'm going to say is that the reason I think there are real stakes here for this government that we have about eroding the city manager's authority, and I think that what this represents, what it is it's not as innocuous. It was not a group product. I didn't see it. You didn't hear about it beforehand. So this is my response, and I feel I'm entitled to make the argument about it.
But
So
you
that's-
were in
that's
the
my
room when
argument.
we were having the discussion.
I didn't agree that we were going to pass
Okay.
a charter amendment. I didn't see it in advance. I had no say in it, and I vehemently disagree with it for the
All right,
reasons I'm
that's
describing.
fine. But I think you're bringing a lot of points into this conversation right now.
Mayor, I'm willing to call the question unless there's more conversation.
Is there any
And the motion still stands to move to not adopt an ordinance adding section 2-159 to chapter 2, article 3.
Second.
All right. Any further discussion? All right, please vote.
So it'd be
It's 3-2. All right, any other business? Nope. All right, matters by the public. Anyone here to speak? All right, closing matters by the public. Meeting adjourned. Have a great evening.